My name is Izumi Ohno, Professor of the National Graduate Institute for Policy Studies, in charge of GRIPS Development Forum. We conduct policy-oriented research in such areas as international development, economic transformation and industrialization, and development cooperation. We work globally from Asia to African countries, but especially our team has extensive engagement in Vietnam and Ethiopia through industrial policy dialogues. Today, I am pleased to host a webinar entitled The Shifting Trend of Authoritarian States in Developing World. Are they developmental enough? With excellent speakers. This webinar is motivated by the changing political economy landscape of economic development and our desire to consider its implication for development cooperation. In the late 20th century, high-performing economies in East Asia, such as South Korea, Taiwan and Singapore, adopted authoritarian regime and then produced remarkable industrial results. In this century, some African national leaders, such as Prime Minister Meles in Ethiopia and President Kagame in Rwanda, embraced the East Asian developmental model to accelerate growth. Also, South Korea and China continue to share their developmental experiences with the developing countries. But more recent decades, it seems that authoritarianism and developmentalism have entered a new phase in the history of economic development. More specifically, democracy began to decline and authoritarianism became more popular globally, regardless among the West, emerging economies, and developing countries. National leaders in new authoritarian states seems to have neither the interest nor the knowledge in promoting economic development. Why our non-developmental dictatorship is increasing? What are the implications for the world at large? And how should development partners conduct their cooperation with such states? These are the issues we'd like to discuss today. To this end, we have invited 3 excellent speakers who will present their analysis, each 25 minutes, and then this will be followed by the discussion and Q&A session, approximately 30 minutes with your participation. The Q&A session will be moderated by Ms. Sayoko Uesu, Research Associate of GRIPS Development Forum. So let me introduce today's speakers in the order of presentation. First, Dr. Yumi Horikane, Professor of Meiji Universities. She specializes in political economy in East Asia and development cooperation. She will speak about the East Asian developmental state model, its relevance in the contemporary world. Next, Kenichi Ohno, a Professor Emeritus of GRIPS. He specializes in development economies, economics and industrial policies. And he will speak about developing countries in the multipolar world, fleeting allegiance, competition for coalition building, and non-developmental authoritarianism. Third, Ms. Minjun Park, Adjunct Professor, Sookmyung Women's University from South Korea. She specializes in development cooperation, and Professor Park will speak about aid as autobiography, South Korea's foreign aid allocation in authoritarian states. So now may I invite Professor Horikane to give a presentation in 25 minutes. And also I will ask Sayoko to moderate the rest of the program. So Horikane sensei, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much indeed for introducing me, as well as, first of all, giving me the opportunity to participate in this interesting seminar. My name is Yumi Horikane, as introduced, from Meiji University, Tokyo. I've been working for years on the East Asian developmental state, which should be the reason why I'm invited here today. So let's start my presentation. I would like to talk a bit about the history and the background and theory and model of the East Asian developmental state. Okay, so I like to talk about East Asian developmental state model or the theory. Oh. This is my outline of the presentation. I start with the concept which was created in the late 20th century, and then I move to the current argument taking place about the developmental state model, and then would like to move to the future of the developmental state, or the possibility of developmental state in the contemporary world. So let me start with the concept. So I'll start with the origin. The origin of the concept is actually not the development, but the Japanese, what we call Japanese miracle. Please look at this figure first, which shows the background of the concept, the Japanese miracle. This shows the GDP growth, or not the growth rate, but the GDP, growing GDP of G5 countries, major industrial economies in the 20th century from 1960s to recent years. Due to the by far the largest size of the US economy, the differences among the remaining 4 countries could be seen as insignificant. But what we see more closely, when we see more closely, we can identify the very good performance of the Japanese economy. The Japanese economy was doing very well around this. Yet actually, this is due to rapid yen appreciation, not the growing volume of Japanese GDP itself. The Japanese high economic growth period is from the 1960s to mid-70s, around here. At this point, in 1967, we cannot see anything, actually. But around in this year, the Japanese GNP surpassed that of the West Germany, making Japan the second largest economy in the Western Bloc. And then this is per capita GDP growth. Here, the size of the economy, population of the US is controlled. So here we see the impact of the Japanese growth more clearly, I think. In the year, in the year 1987, per capita GNP of Japan has surpassed that of the US, making the Japan as one of the richest country in the world, and becoming even much larger in the following years. The book I will introduce in the next slide was published in 1982, around that time, which is entitled Meiji and the Japanese Miracle. Okay, this is the one by Chalmers Johnson, Meiji and the Japanese Miracle, which proposed the concept of the developmental state in the world. Please note here that the concept of the developmental state was created to explain the difference of the Japanese economy from other industrial states. The question was why Japan was doing so good, particularly when compared with the US. Johnson's answer were, the role played by the state was different. The role of the government in usual Western countries like the US, UK was regulatory, according to Johnson, making rules and regulations with which the healthy market and society functions. However, according to him, the Japanese case was identified to be different. It was developmental. So here are the characteristics of the Japanese model of the developmental state. Since the time is limited, I will skip the details while emphasizing the first one, existence of small but elite bureaucracy, and the 4, which was composed of what we called best and brightest. So very much capable elite bureaucracy was there. And the number 4, within the bureaucracy, a pilot organization like MITI, Ministry of International Trade and Industry, have played an important role. This was Johnson's model of the Japanese developmental state. So here, there was no discussion about authoritarianism. Obviously, Japan in the post-war world was democracy. But this model was soon applied by himself, Johnson himself, to Korea and Taiwan first, and then to others as well, which will make the contemporary developmental state model. So, development of the model of the East Asian developmental state. The major components of the developmental state is theorized mostly based on the East Asian experience in order to explain the state-led and sustained high growth with equity, which was, for example, explained by the World Bank famous report of the East Asian miracle. So here are the features described by many scholars as the feature of the East Asian developmental state. First of all, there was a determined developmental elite who was determined to make development happen. And under him or her, there was a powerful, competent, and economic bureaucracy which was, however, insulated from economic interest or society. So they were there, but not pushed so much by various kinds of interest in society. Therefore, that kind of relative autonomy of the state elite and the institutions were there. So states can do whatever they think they need. And in addition, so the state was made very strong as opposed to the weak civil society. In a word, civil society was repressed. However, within the civil society or within the society, there were some group of people who needed to be connected with the state in order to make development happen, which is the business elite. So effective management of non-state economic interests, maybe mainly business, was there. In other words, there was a kind of public-private connectedness, or what some people say embedded autonomy were there. So state was autonomous, but it was still embedded in society with upper hand with the state. Therefore, and the state was very strong, but the society in general, particularly some objection against the state or the state policy was repressed. But still, actually, there is a point that the state elite or the state institutions, state bureaucracy was keen that they need to feel society. And they need to be accepted by the people, at least it is right for them to be there to rule the people. So their legitimacy of ruling was given through or achieved through attaining their purpose of making development happen, making people's life better than before. So there was a repression, but still the state elite were keen on the economic performance which may persuade the people that their rule is right. So that's the repression and legitimacy by performance. And in addition, there was an external threat for all of these countries under the Cold War. Many of them were the frontline countries of the Cold War. So due to the existence of the external threat, internally as well as internationally, the strong state, building and keeping strong state was legitimized or accepted by all. So that's the feature of the East Asian developmental state. So obviously, all of these features leads to kind of authoritarianism, which means that issue of democracy or democratization or legitimacy based on the democratic piece or whatever is always at problem. So let me add a few words about the issue of democratization. So in these economies, the leaders were determined to make growth and development happen, and to some extent, equity as well. And in fact, these leaders, these countries have succeeded in bringing them, making the people's standard of living rising, and the level of education rising as well. Ordinary people thought that leaders were good, better than the previous ones who could not make them richer or more educated. So these leads to regime's legitimacy rising. With time, however, these people started to think, now we also want freedom and more democracy rather than autocracy or more money. More freedom was regarded more important than more wealth. Then what happened? Now their legitimacy of regime's legitimacy of giving people better life was shaken, igniting democratization movement. This happened almost at the same time in the world. In the mid to late 1980s, both in South Korea and Taiwan, and they realized democratization. Peter Evans, one of the developmental state theorists, called the developmental states as its own grave digger. The better they performed, the shorter they lived. So they needed to be denied because they have performed so well. It was the case in South Korea and Taiwan, yet not in the case of Singapore. Now, let's look at the economic performance of these countries. So here are Singapore, Japan, Hong Kong is a bit different, but South Korea. Those countries were usually called as East Asian developmental state, while these Southeast Asian countries, sometimes particularly in Japan, called as developmental state or developmental regime, developmental dictatorship. But obviously, their performance are a bit different from those ones. And though in English language literature, those countries are usually not regarded as East Asian developmental state. So anyway, the typical East Asian developmental state has achieved that kind of performance. While these countries are also, except for the Philippines, these are the East Asian miracle countries, which mean that they have done better. So when we compare South Korea with other countries in the region, the difference is obvious. These are Brazil, Mexico, Latin American NICs, while South Korea as Asian NICs is much better, performed much better. And these are other countries in the world. So those are the developmental East Asian developmental state. Okay, so then what happened to those developmental countries afterwards? Here are some current arguments related to the developmental state model. There are three kinds of issues as a point of argument. The first, about the durability of the model. The model countries, South Korea, Taiwan, these countries still developmental, although they deviate from the original model of authoritarian developmentalism. At least in Korea and Taiwan, they are no more authoritarian. while Singapore is still rather authoritarian. Then, do they still intervene in the economy to guide or facilitate the changes or transformation? Some say seemingly no, while others may say yes. Singapore in particular is, according to many scholars, still developmental. The second issue is about the applicability. The first one is about the, afterwards of the original model countries, but this is the applicability of the model to other countries. In the contemporary world, the original Japanese or East Asian developmental state model was about the situation under the Cold War. From them, the geopolitical situation substantially changed now. In addition, globalization proceeded, making the world very different in the more and more borderless global society. Government interventions in the economy or market was seen very much limited until quite recently. The situation is now a bit different. Yet how about now? Seemingly different, about which we will talk later. And then the issue of democracy and authoritarianism. Here, let me add some explanation. As explained, the typical model of the developmental state assumed authoritarian regimes as the political setting and understood that economic performance and political participation were in the trade-off relations. Namely, good economic performance was achieved in the developmental state by limiting political liberties, while where the liberty and democracy was more respected and maintained, like the case of India in the 20th century, economic performance could not be good. However, in a few decades, in some developmental states like South Korea and Taiwan, democratization movement started, finally achieving a democratic society, making Korea and Taiwan now free and wealthy societies. However, the richest of the developmental state, Singapore, which is now by per capita income by far the richest in Asia, Singapore is still keeping its strong state as before and keep growing. So, is authoritarianism necessary? Can a democratic regime take a developmental way and becomes effective as such? Can the features explained above be achieved in a democracy? We need to explore these kind of things. So, well, finally, let's think about the most recent situation of the world, which is often referred to as democratic backsliding. As explained, the typical East Asian developmental state in the 20th century were authoritarian within the context of the Cold War, while the third wave democratization affected some of them, by which I mean that some of them, like Taiwan and South Korea, were democratized. Now, in the days of democratic backsliding, many former democratized countries are going back to some kind of authoritarianism or rise of authoritarian states, together with the tendency of the revision of Washington Consensus or to free market or economic liberalism, a favorable environment or permissive environment for a bit authoritarian developmental state might emerge again to allow authoritarian developmental regimes emerge and survive, like China or Vietnam. So let's look at some relative performance of the economy in some Asian and African countries. China and Botswana. These are usually regarded as developmental states, while Botswana is a kind of democracy. Since China and Botswana were too good, let's look at the rest of their performance more closely by deleting China and Botswana. And I added Vietnam as well. In fact, I thought a couple of years ago, Myanmar, the yellow one here, before the recent coup, which happened in February 2021, was expected to be a developmental state, following the case of South Korea in particular. But the coup happened, and the Myanmar economy or society is stagnated and confused. Recent performance, as well as their political situation on Bangladesh, this one, together with India and, of course, Vietnam, might be near the model. Yeah, look at this one. Bangladesh, this one. And India is this one. And they started to grow rapidly around, around in the first decade of 2000. How we understand others' performance and explain them? Well, we need more studies, more in-depth comparative studies of respective economies. The environment is different, as well as their resource endowments, national or ethnic composition in society, or history or culture. However, one thing is very clear. They cannot copy the experience of the East Asian developmental states in the 20th century. While some countries are trying to learn from it, which could be possible, but they cannot copy everything, and institutionalization is very much different. And one of the features of the successful developmental state in East Asia was actually the very strong state capacity, which was based upon institutionalization, which cannot be easily copied from one society to another. Right. So, therefore, this does not mean they cannot be developmental. The copying the institutions or history of developmental states is difficult or almost impossible. But they can learn and they can aim to be developmental if they are intend to do. So, finally, the question is, what will happen to these global South countries in the coming years? It is a very difficult question. Therefore, I stop here, leaving this question open to you. Thank you very much for your listening. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Professor Horikane, for your highly instructive presentation. I heard that you're currently working on a book, writing a book on developmentalism. So we really look forward to listen to your views during the Q&A. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Then, thank you. Then our second panelist is Professor Kenichi Ohno. Kenichi Sensei, the floor is yours.
Okay. Ladies and gentlemen, I am not an expert on politics or international relations, but I have studied about 30 governments in Asia and Africa and compared their policy methods. In particular, I spent many years talking to the governments of Vietnam and Ethiopia in industrial policy dialogue. It is from this perspective that I'd like to talk about the recent behaviors of developing countries. Let me make it bigger. These are my arguments, Skip. Now, let me just start with something obvious, something you already know. That's the deterioration of US leadership. Or more generally, relative economic decline of the developed democracy camp, which includes US, EU, and Japan. As for America, I think it has moved from a reliable leader to self-centered troublemaker. Maybe that's a little bit too much, but they have declined, and they have declining military commitments all over the world, and America First policies of all kinds. Western democracy is being challenged. I think that Donald Trump basically ended the American model, which everyone was looking up to. And then the malfunctioning of Western democracy is challenged by the Chinese. We also now know that free markets are volatile and divisive and must be regulated. There are many crises that were caused by free markets, and widening income gaps in many countries are also seen. So we are times are changing. During the Cold War time, bipolar world, developing world reacted in two or three ways. Non-aligned movement was very strong, but they also pursued the political and economic benefits by belonging to one camp or the other. Post-Cold War period, unipolar, the dominance of US and its guiding principles. So the developing world adopted democracy and market mechanism, at least in form, if not in substance, to continue receiving support from the World Bank, IMF, and so forth and so on. Now we are in a post-Cold War period, which is multipolar, and there's no vision dominates and so forth. There's competition among many hegemons and also southern leaders. And this is the topic of my talk today. I'll show you just two graphs. This is a contribution to global GDP, the shares of the global GDP, history, and the forecast. I apologize for a little bit older data, but I don't think these things will change dramatically. I think the advanced nations' share of GDP is declining continuously, while China and India rising. This is a shift in political regimes in Africa. And something happened in 1991, and the multi-party systems increased dramatically. Were Africans realizing the value of democracy at that time? Were people in Africa did they desire democracy? I think the main reason is that the Soviet Union's collapse and the end of the Cold War. So this diagram shows that the very strong impact of external or internal forces on the choices, political choices of the developing countries. Now, I'd like to discuss three recent trends. The number one's fleeting allegiance, but I would just say that these are not really new trends. These existed in the past, this one and the other two, but I can say that these trends became dominant, and the world now has to cope with them more seriously. In a bipolar world, that's the past, developing countries had only three choices: go to camp 1 or camp 2 or non-aligned. But in a multipolar world where there are several different level leaders, there are many more options. The world is more complex, and developing countries pursue concrete benefits over fundamental ideology. And concrete benefits means aid, trade, FDI, technology, human exchange. These are economics. There's also national security, military aid, and diplomatic support and protection from Western criticisms and sanctions. Now, the values such as democracy, rule of law, human rights, and no aggression, that is peace, do not move developing countries today. Although national leaders may have their personal opinions about these things, they don't become policy principles of the state. In a multipolar world, developing countries cannot be tied down to one vision or political camp, although US hosted the 2 summits for democracy recently. As benefit-seeking games go on, leader candidates, Japan, US, and China, and so forth, they must continuously please developing countries because partnership is transitory and conditional on offered benefits. So these are the things that are offered. China offers one belt, one road. We offer free and open Indo-Pacific. World Bank and IMF loans. You can also borrow from China and the AIIB. For African countries, they participate in Japan's TCAD, China's FOCAC, and US-Africa Leaders Summit, and Russia also has a summit. Now, I think developing countries go to all of them or most of them, although the hosts are rivals to each other. UN General Assembly vote on the Russia must leave Ukraine. Some people are surprised there were 7 against and 32 abstain. But is it really surprising in this multipolar world? Now, recently, Japan hosted G7 Hiroshima Summit, inviting India, Indonesia, Vietnam, Brazil, and so forth. Will this bring them to the Western side? I think not permanently. Number 2, there's also politicking in the South, global South situation. The global South is often used today as a synonym for developing and emerging countries. I think this term is a little bit too much used. However, this concept is a political and dynamic concept whose members cannot be pinned down by location, income, or political regime. Unlike the definition of low and the middle income or upper middle income countries defined by the World Bank, by the numbers. I'd say that Global South is a politicized group of victimized nations that protest and demand actions against the world ruled by the West, US, EU, and maybe Japan is included. It became more active as economic power shifted from the West to the South. And issues taken up include globalization, market instability, trade system, environment, climate change, so forth and so on. But in reality, not all developing countries are victims. Some developing countries do great harm to peace, human rights, food supply, climate, forests. So there's a lot of political narratives here. There's a tiered or different level of competition among China, India, Russia, and the other southern countries. Well, among the southern countries, some compete for global and regional influence. They want influence, while most others remain non-aligned, or I would say multi-aligned, benefit seekers. But China is the obvious leader in terms of economic and military power in challenging the West, but not all developing countries may gather under its flag. India is economically and militarily less powerful than China at this moment, but Prime Minister Modi, taking advantage of G20 chairmanship this year, delivers India's message to increase its global influence and bargaining power against China, at least this year. I think we know that what India is trying to do in this framework. Russia, sanctioned by the West, steps up its political, military, and economic diplomacy in Africa, Middle East, and so forth. I think we know what Russia is doing, but the results remain to be seen. There are subgroups such as Indonesia, Brazil, Saudi Arabia, UAE, Turkey, South Africa, Rwanda. There are more. And these countries want some influence regionally or globally, but they will not become hegemons. They're too small, but they still aim to increase their global regional presence. So this is what's happening. It's becoming very activated in the South. All this is very common in international politics, which is likely to continue. And the third point is the rise of non-developmental authoritarianism. I think since around the 2010s, non-developmental authoritarian states have increased around the globe. And I would say that this multipolar world allows the existence of dictators with impunity. The first is the weakening and relativization of our American democracy model. We already discussed that. If US and EU want to criticize and sanction, there will be China and Russia extending political and economic support. So you can choose your host. existence of second and third tier southern countries, they also tolerate, cover, or support dictators. So I think this multipolar world allows dictator to survive very comfortably. This is a VDEM Liberal Democracy Index, which is mainly focused on freedom of assembly, association, and expression, media, and so forth, and the election quality. I think these are the core of the democratic requirements. And as you can see, all over the world, democracy improved toward 2010 or so, and then it has been declining since then. Some examples from Asia, if you look at Indochina, we see many non-developmental authoritarianism. This is the area where Japanese peacekeeping operations, OD and FDI concentrated in the past. Thailand, Thai politics is always unstable. And there's a deep-rooted confrontation between red shirts and yellow shirts. But military coup in 2014 occurred, and now Thai is a military government. Myanmar is, I think Professor Horikane mentioned a little bit, it's much worse. Myanmar was very suppressive military government for a long, long time. Although there was some sign of democracy and initial growth started, I think, 2014, but it ended in 2021 when the military took over this oppressive regime, and that's very oppressive right now. Cambodia, I think Prime Minister Hun Sen's People's Party is in place for a long time. I think they have been relatively successful in economic development, but Mr. Hun Sen is becoming more suppressive and authoritarian these days. And I think this year his power will be transferred to his son. Laos is also a one-party ruled by the People's Revolutionary Party. Lao politics is significantly influenced or just a copy of the Vietnam's politics. And I heard that a few opposition leaders were killed, and we don't know who killed them. Now, Vietnam is one country I know very well because I've been there for nearly 30 years studying. Vietnam, I think, will go from the lower middle income to upper middle income very soon, this year or within a few years. So they are becoming rich. The Communist Party rules in Vietnam. This is a party dominance. But until recently, top leaders of Vietnam were very eager to develop and industrialize. They encouraged human resource, trade, FDI, technology, digitization, and so forth. In other words, socialist ideology was not an obstacle for development. And Vietnam has weaknesses, and also Japan and other donors have supported Vietnam in many, many ways, including the intellectual support that Japan provided. And I took part in some of them. But under the current Communist Party leadership in the last several years, socialist ideology became more important. Ministers and high officials familiar with business world and economic diplomacy are being removed. This is a political fight, on the pretext of anti-corruption charges. That's a normal charge. Ministerial activities are now frozen for fear of being accused of any error or corruption. So ministers don't start any new projects right now. Now, Ethiopia is another country I know very well. I had a policy dialogue since 2008. Now, Ethiopia is still a low income, but Prime Minister Meles criticized the Washington Consensus and learned vigorously from East Asia. He adopted Korea's monthly export steering committee, learned the Kaizen from JICA, and engaged in industrial policy dialogue with us, JICA and the GRIPS. Prime Minister Hailemariam basically followed the Meles line, but under the current Prime Minister Abiy, he does not lead the economic policies himself, but lets his macroeconomic team work on industrial issues. That's okay. But the more serious problem is a political and military front. Federal forces in Tigray started an internal war in 2020. Although they got into the peace, it's still precarious. Other ethnic and even religious conflicts also erupted. US and EU accused Ethiopia for human rights violation, and foreign currency shortage became severe, and many factors are now inoperative. Now, why did this happen in Ethiopia is I will not discuss or analyze. I think the Ethiopian researchers should explain why this is happening. The only thing I would like to say is Ethiopia was Africa's rising star, going toward the developmental state and achieving double-digit growth with accelerating FDI inflow. But euphoria ended due to the military conflicts and the worsening balance of payments crisis. It's very sad. Ethiopia was more developmental. Now it has many problems. I just touched on East Asia's historical, authoritarian developmentalism, AD, but Professor Horikane already explained a lot, so I will go very quickly. These are the conditions of the AD in Asia. Strong leader. Supreme national goal is a development, even an obsession. Competent technocrats, legitimacy derived from successive development, and people support it because GDP is rising. This is a typical pattern of growth. The development starts do the top-down growth policy, economy grows, new problems arise, such as income gaps and environment and so forth. Social policy ameliorates them. So social stability and popular support maintained, round and round for about one generation. And then the economy exists into the democratic and high-income society. This happened in Korea and Taiwan in the 1980s, but not everyone. This is authoritarian development states history in East Asia, a little bit controversial which ones are the AD and which ones are not. This is we created based on Professor Suehiro's diagram. Pink ones are authoritarian developmentalism, other ones are not AD. One thing, as I said, South Korea and Taiwan succeeded in doing the AD and then graduated into a high-income society. But China and Singapore continue to be authoritarian, although their income is very high. Singapore's income is very, very high, but they're still a little bit authoritarian, as Professor Horikane mentioned. Philippines, Marcos, Indonesia's Suharto were okay at the beginning, but they became non-developmental toward the end. Thailand, on and off. And there are several countries which are not AD. They may be authoritarian, but they are not developmental enough. So I would say that current authoritarian states that are emerging today are not AD because they do not fulfill the conditions for East Asia's AD. In particular, economic growth is neither national obsession nor regime legitimacy. The same thing is that national leaders and technocrats lack both passion and knowledge for economic development and industrialization. And current authoritarian states are similar to traditional predatory states or neo-patrimonial states, except the suppression is strengthened, not eased, even after reaching upper middle income. So they're going to high income with suppression. Digital technology is used by both sides to fight between authoritarianism and democracy. So unlike Korea and Taiwan in the 80s, the expanding middle class is not allowed to express views or demand democracy. Economics and politics are detached, and transition to a more democratic regime is not assured. So let me conclude. This multipolar world with several, not two, but several, leader candidates is likely to persist. And the realism rules, not idealism, because the developing countries are looking for a concrete short-term benefits. They're not going for democracy or rule of law, at least as the state principles. Okay, in this world, the donor side, I think we need a more information gathering and policy dialogue with the developed country leaders, because their requirements are different from one country to another, and they change over time. So no one side fits all here. Or southern state countries playing the benefit-seeking game and hopping groups run the risks of losing long-term policy consistency. A friend to all is a friend to none. I think the realist and idealist views must be combined in any diplomacy, though they also need some long-term views. And it is difficult to predict the future of non-developmental authoritarian states. At present, there were few or no signs of their dissolution. Internally or externally, authorities' digital grip may reinforce its suppressive power against people. And let me just say a few things for Japanese audience. Japan has trained many policy makers and implementers, engineers and workers, and installed many institutions in developing countries. These are Japan's most precious foreign assets, and they should be mobilized to solve problems in developing countries, Japan, and even the world. Japan should not compete with China in terms of aid, volume, speed, and visibility. That is a game we're going to lose for sure. Japan should cooperate in a way that fits Japan's rich knowledge, past experience, and a very limited budget. So these are the possibilities. Trust-based long-term relationship is key to mutual prosperity. Japan has tried to build such a relationship and should continue to double this effort. Trust-building projects may not draw immediate attention or applause like big stadiums, railroads, and airports, but they fortify relationships in the long run. Thank you very much for your attention.
Okay. Thank you very much, Professor Kenichi Ohno, for sharing with us your frank views on a number of Asian and African countries. And now we will ask Professor Park, our last panelist, to start her presentation. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me well? So, my name is Minjung Park. I'm from Sookmyung Women's University, and I'm very pleased to join today's interesting webinar with distinguished professors at GRIPS. So the title of my presentation is Aid as Autobiography, South Korea's Foreign Aid Allocation in Authoritarian States. Let's start. So, South Korea has been viewed as an emerging donor for more than 2 decades. But currently, many experts in South Korean academia and policy circles are now starting to recognize the fact that South Korea is not an emerging donor anymore, but a major donor in the global community. Last year, South Korea ranked the 16th largest donor on the OECD DOC, second largest donor in Asia. As you can see, after Japan, with Japan's aid volume being about 6 times bigger than South Korea's. Although South Korea's aid volume has expanded rapidly, it has never met the best known target of the 0.7% ODA to GNI ratio. In relative terms, South Korea ranked 27th largest donor among 29 members, except the EU here, and with 0.17% of ODA to GNI, while Japan ranked 15th with 0.39% of ODA to GNI. Although South Korea's ODA in relative terms is not that impressive, but from 2010 to 2018, Korea achieved the highest annual growth rate of 11.9% in average among that member countries, of which annual average growth rate is just 2.4%. In the case of Japan, it ranked 9th largest donor in terms of the annual growth rate of ODA, with 5.1% from the same period. Unlike some Western donors who have drastically reduced their ODA volume during the COVID-19 pandemic, for example, as you can see from the graph, the UK has reduced its aid by more than 20%, Sweden by more than 17%, and South Korea has increased its aid by more than 20% during the pandemic, making it the second country after Italy to increase its ODA volume during the pandemic. And this trend, South Korea's aid is expected to be a further increase under the Yoon administration, which took office in 2022 last year and will run until 2026. So in case of this year, South Korea has had significant budgetary increase of ODA to 4.78 trillion Korean won, which is equal to 3.7 billion US dollar. But this has been the very big increase. However, the unprecedented depreciation of South Korean won has caused the total ODA figure in US dollars to decrease. I believe this is the quite similar case in Japan. The yen has recently depreciated significantly, right? For South Korea, like Japan, it has showed a strong preference for Asia. So, with more than 1/3 of its aid going to Asian countries. So, from the OECD peer reviews, it continuously recommends Korean government a more balanced aid allocation by allocating more ODA to different regions. But the Korean government has maintained its preference for Asia. So as you can see from this chart, of South Korea's top 20 recipient countries in 2021, 9 are in Asia, 8 in Africa, and 3 in Latin America. Strong preference for Asian countries. Number 1, Philippines, followed by Vietnam, Bangladesh, Myanmar, something like that. But if we categorize these 20 countries by regime type, there are no full democracies, 5 flawed democracies, 7 hybrid regimes, and 8 authoritarian regimes. So by the way, this categorization of regime type is based on the EIU's Democracy Index last year. So, is South Korea allocating aid without considering regime type? Because South Korea provide aid as autobiographical? David Williams from Cambridge University argues that a country's donor behavior is autobiographical based on its own experiences of utilizing ODA and its trajectories of development. So actually, in the case of South Korea, from 1945 to the late 90s, it received 12.7 billion worth of ODA, which has been regarded that it was utilized as a catalyst for development. So most of the ODA were the loans during authoritarian regimes, like the period of Park Chung-hee administration, Chun Doo-han administration. And as you can see from the graph, 3 top donors of Korea for Korea were EU members, Japan, and the US. What is particularly interesting is that the current older generation clearly remembers the previous authoritarian regimes received foreign aid and they used them wisely for national development. So in case of the Seoul-Busan Expressway, Busan, the second largest city of Korea, it was built by foreign loans, and the POSCO the steel company, it used to be the national company, but now is partly national. It also built by foreign loans. So I strongly believe that this institutional memory contributes to the fact that Korean government's current practice of lending loans to authoritarian regimes has been accepted by Korean society without much of a problem. Then, how about the case of Japan? Among Japan's top 20 largest recipient countries in 2021, there is only one country with full democracy, Mauritius, and 5 flawed democracies like India, Philippines, and 6 hybrid regimes like Bangladesh, Indonesia, and 8 authoritarian regimes, Myanmar, Cambodia, and as you can see, not much difference with South Korea. Then we can ask this question: is this a characteristic of Asian donors? Let's see the case of Canada, which has been praised for pushing foreign aid based on liberalist internationalism, for pushing human security, pursuing human security and liberal values through ODA. But as you can see from the chart, in 2021, among Canada's top 20 recipient countries, there are no full democracies, only one flawed democracy, that was Ghana, 5 hybrid regimes, and 13 authoritarian regimes. So, Canada has even more authoritarian regimes than South Korea and Japan. Do you think is this surprising? But this is not the unique case of Canada. Actually, there has been a clear increase in ODA flows to authoritarian regimes. Although, as explained before by other professors, they are not developmental enough, but more ODA to these authoritarian regimes among the OECD DAC members. So according to the OECD's publication titled ODA by Regime Context, published last year, ODA flows to liberal democracy have decreased by 63% in blue color from 2010 to 2019, whereas ODA flows to closed autocracies in red color have almost tripled with a 178% increase. So here, this publication distinguishes 4 types of political system: closed autocracies, electoral autocracies, electoral democracies, and liberal democracies. So here, closed autocracy meaning citizens do not have the right to choose either to the chief executive of the government or the legislature through multi-party elections. So since 2010, the increase in ODA to authoritarian regimes has been a clear trend in OECD DAC. And if we take into account non-DAC donors like China, Turkey, Thailand, we can assume that ODA to authoritarian regimes has been even larger. And also, according to this publication, autocratization does not tend to be met with a decline in overall ODA, but the truth is the contrary. So if we compare the top 10 autocratizers, ODA's flows from OECD DAC between 2010 and 2019, 9 autocratizers on the list, except one exception of Nicaragua, ODA flows to their countries have increased from 1%, like the case of Benin, and 120%, like the case of Turkey. So, contrary to the expectations or rhetoric that foreign aid can be a catalyst for spreading democracy and human rights, the number of authoritarian regimes has increased from 69 in 2010 to 75 in 2019, as Professor Horikane explained. Democratic backsliding, we actually observed, right? And the ODA volume they've received have increased over the past decade. However, countries in the process of democratization tend to receive more ODA, for sure, through programs like governance support. So, from the findings, we can conclude that regime type in the pattern of ODA distribution is not significant at this point of time. So it shows that the limitations in reflecting the political system of recipient countries into ODA allocation decisions due to the international political dynamics explained by Professor Ohno in this multipolar world, and the pursuit of interest-driven foreign relations and the need for humanitarian assistance. So, if it is not the regime type, then what? What influences ODA allocation of Korea? In case of Korea, it is the economy level of recipient countries. So more than 2/3 of Korea's ODA goes to middle-income countries, like lower middle-income countries in green color and upper middle-income countries in blue color. And this trend is quite the same in Japan. More than 66% of Japanese bilateral ODA in 2021 supported lower middle-income countries. Also, Japan shows quite larger portion of supporting upper middle-income countries compared to OECD DAC's average statistics. Then how about the Canada? For Canada, it does not show its preference for middle-income countries. Actually, more than half of Canadian ODA in 2021 are not located by income level, probably because it goes through multilateral channels or in the form of humanitarian assistance, which is one significant part of foreign aid. So I argue that this tendency to prefer middle-income countries, this is for considering South Korea's national economic development with more engagement with foreign markets. I think this kind of tendency is one of the legacy of South Korea's developmental state that is shown in development cooperation sector. And this kind of legacy is expected to be further strengthened during the conservative Yoon administration. This is the key word of the new administration's International Development Cooperation Policy Direction published last year. This current administration plans to keep increasing its ODA volume up to the 10th largest donor in the world, and it will contribute to realization of universal values like SDGs, human rights, peace, as a global pivotal state. That's the vision that South Korea wants to achieve through diplomatic activities. But here is interesting part. South Korea wants to foster Korean private sector engagement in development cooperation, and South Korea wants to enhance institutional basis for Korean businesses, global expansion through ODA, and also promote the brand image of Korean companies through ODA. very economic interest-driven foreign aid policy, right? And I believe that this South Korean developmentalist aid will be further strengthened. So the old state business alliance established during the times of developmental state is likely to be further strengthened in the development cooperation sector, similar to the Lee Myung-bak administration period, because they are very similar vision and practice with the current administration. They are from the same party, almost the same leaders in different ministries. And then South Korea's strong preference for concessional loans as opposed to grants and tying ODA with commercial interest and industrial politics, and less involvement of civil society will be reinforced during the Yoon administration, which will widening a gap from the best practice, so-called best practice formulated by traditional European donors. And then this Yoon administration pushed for value-based diplomacy with a focus on promoting freedom, peace, and prosperity based on its liberal democratic values and cooperation. But this does not really match with this commercial interest foreign aid policy. So I think the value-based diplomacy remains to be seen. It will be, I suspect that it can be a diplomatic rhetoric only. So remaining question here is, to what extent will value-based diplomacy of Yoon administration affect the ODA allocation to authoritarian or hybrid regimes? Are they going to focus more ODA to democratic recipient countries? I'm not so sure. And will there be a policy competition between value-based aid and developmentalist aid within Korean society? I'm not so sure, because still, value-based aid is not the mainstream idea, only from the academia or civil society. Government specialists, government officials, they still have the mindset of developmentalist aid. That is my argument. Thank you very much for your listening. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Park, for your detailed analysis and very interesting findings on the aid allocation to authoritarian states. Well, now we will move to the discussion and Q&A session, and we will have 30 minutes. And the first round will be focused on the cross-cutting question raised by Professor Izumi Ohno. Then for the second round, we will ask our panelists to respond individually to the questions posted on the Q&A box. And Professor Izumi Ohno, thank you for joining us. So you will have 5 or 7 minutes. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sayoko, and thank you very much for the excellent the presentation by 3 speakers. Maybe taking advantage of my position as a webinar host, I'd like to ask a few questions. Yeah. First question is that common to Horikane sensei and also Kenichi Ohno. The second question is to the Park sensei. I think Horikane sensei and your presentation regarding what happened to these global South countries in the coming years. So I'd like to ask both of you, in this multipolar world, how can we motivate or incentivize these so-called global South countries, emerging economies and developing countries, to have to become developmental, to adopt developmentalism? Because you talked about the importance of leadership commitment on development and the coalition between state leaders, the leaders and technocrats, and also working with maybe private sector for the shared objective, regardless the regime. But how can we, what kind of incentive we can maybe provide either externally or internally to make that kind of developmental elements would revive? This is my question to both of you. And then my question to Professor Min-Jun Park is that I was so interested in your kind of presentation, including that the regime type ODA allocation. I think in this case, maybe channels of ODA provision is important because I think that the Canada support more through civil society or NGO sector, while South Korea and Japan works mainly through G2G, that cooperation. But so this is my first comment. The second issue is that value-based aid, vice versa, developmental aid. And so you said that both may be trade-off. But my question is it possible to make them compatible? Yeah, this is my question. Yeah. Okay. So maybe Horikane sensei or Kenichi-san, if you can share your thought. Yeah.
Oh, okay. So, shall we, may I have a few words? Well, it's a very difficult question, very extremely hard question. But I think, first of all, in the 20th century, when Taiwan and South Korea and Singapore and some other Southeast Asian countries are emphasizing the importance of development, and becoming richer and richer. Actually, when we are looking at only these countries, it was a case. They are such, and it may be since these countries are closely located with each other. It may be the mood, but when we look at the developing countries all over the world, actually there are only a few of the tens or even hundreds of developing countries who are not developmental. So, of course, as a kind of lip service, of course, becoming richer and they are now independent and they've been exploited so that they've been poor. But once they became independent, they will have their politics and economy to make the people happier and richer. That was the kind of shared common sense. So nobody denies that. But there was a politics. And even if they say development and growth, they tended to have more important political reasons why they need to concentrate their effort to something else. Therefore, of course, it is very much difficult then how these East Asian development countries have become developmental, very committed. It really depends. But the fact, at least, is that developmental state really committed to development, to make development happen, even if they are for legitimize their rule. Most of them are. Park Chung-hee came in power by coup, and Chiang Kai-shek is almost a kind of, what can they occupy? They are outcomers. So they needed to make the people understood that it is good for them to have them as leader. So the reason depends, but we need to think that what happened in those countries are quite rare. Therefore, it is not quite not understandable that these days not many political leaders in the global south are developmental. There are some. There are some. And the probability of having these leaders might not have been so different. This is one thing that I think. And the other thing is that after more than half a century of independent, their own history, now their values and purpose are diversified. When they became dependent, they a kind of development, growth, and democracy. Those are a kind of shared value all over the world. Even if they are not so, those are the kind of target that everybody needs to have. But now, after more than half a century of not having those things, they are now ethnic priority or stability or human rights, of course. There are various kinds of things about which leader can claim their legitimacy, right? So to which the people can to some extent agree. So the targets are diversified, and the society are divided. So that making consensus, first of all, is becoming extremely difficult. So even in the case of US politics, everyone is now following Trump, but there are a substantial number of people who are following Trump, so that the Republicans are following Trump, right? So those kind of diversified values and target within the society as well as in international community. Those might be one of the difficulties that we need to think of. So it is not the answer at all, but that's what I think now. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
May I say? How to motivate the developing country governments to become more developmental is very difficult. And that's what we've been trying to do a little bit, but we failed in a sense. I already have the answer, what they need to learn or what they have to adapt. Number one is the top national leadership must be developmental. That's a mindset problem. If you have a president who is only interested in his, money and influence, there's no way World Bank or Japan or Korea can change that. That's a political situation that nobody can change. Number two is if you have a good leader, you need the good, competent technocrats. I think Horikane sensei already mentioned this. If you have a good leader, developmental leader, and the good technocrats, then you have something like Korea or Taiwan or Singapore. But well, again, making technocrats is very difficult when your prime minister, presidents are not very willing to build such technocrats. Now, I would say that there's a selection bias kind of thing here, that in the last 60 years, all the developing countries have already climbed to a high income or at least upper middle income. So the remaining developing countries are not starting with a developmental mindset. So it's more difficult today to teach or motivate these developmental actions. They first have to have a new mindset about the top, but nobody can really control the president's mindset. Okay, so what we have been doing in the last few decades is trying to do something from an academic side. That is to work with choose the best country which seems to have a relatively good leadership. And we chose Ethiopia, for example. As I said, Mr. Melas was very willing to learn from Korea and Japan and other East Asian countries. So I think Ethiopia was very successful in building this national mindset. also the cabinet members, the ministers, the state ministers were very, very developmental. But the problem with Ethiopia is the second part, which is the technocrats. They don't have the technocrats like Singapore, Korea, or Taiwan, or Japan. So although the ministers are very willing, we cannot implement good policies because the good ideas are not translated to the ground actions. So I also worked in Vietnam for a long time, as I said, and it's not succeeding as I can explain more, but so far no big success. Vietnam is going to upper middle income already, but that's not because the policy is good. That's because Vietnam is lucky. So what we have tried, this is what I'm talking the policy dialogue to teach and motivate the technocrats and all, if possible, leaders. But among the remaining developing countries, it's very difficult.
Okay, thank you very much. Yeah, because I just thought about this question because that recently, I think that the British, economist, that also he used to work at the chief economist of the DFID, Stephen Durkin, he wrote The Gambling on Development. And he said that sometimes development bargain, takes place if that the leadership and also technocrats have some kind of venture on maybe the growth promotion, although the direction may not be uncertain, but he observed certain countries have kind of took that kind of path. So I was wondering whether this kind of venture we can motivate that, encourage this kind of venture can take place. But thank you so much for your comments. And then, Park Sensei,
Yes, so thank you very much for the very important question by the Ohno sensei. And I think the developmentalist aid and value-based aid are not completely incompatible, but it's actually very difficult to pursue both at the same time because they have different purpose and visions. For developmentalist aid, they put donor countries' commercial aid for commercial interest first, like the case of Korea, maybe Japan, and China for sure. And whereas value-based aid, they put recipient countries' realization of liberal values, for example, human rights, democracies, etc. But case of South Korea, the government officials, they say by their mouths, they will do value-based foreign aid and diplomacy, but their mindset, as Professor Ohno emphasized, they still have the developmentalist mindset. So if you look at the Korean foreign aid vision papers or the reports, it's a little bit strange because these two different visions, values, are on the same page. So that is the current situation of South Korea as a donor. But maybe in the future, more value-based foreign aid or keep using the legacy of developmental state, not sure yet. But at this moment, we see the past dependency. Thank you.
Thank you very much, because I thought that this is also relevant to maybe Japanese development cooperation, because I think we are Japanese government also trying to promote more and more value-based diplomacy and also universal kind of values, rule of the law and democratic kind of the principle. At the same time, I think we also emphasize that the public-private partnership issues, which we can also observe in the latest development cooperation charter. So I was so interested in learning from Korean cases too, but thank you so much. So Sayoko, may I just maybe return to your,
yes. Thank you very much, Professor Izumi, for moderating the first round. Then we will move to the second round. I have selected 1 or 2 questions or comments for each panelist. So I will start by Professor Horikane. There is one question for Horikane Sensei. Based on your analysis, can we conclude there is no relationship between economic performance and political participation, given also the example you gave of South Korea and Singapore? Thank you.
Well, may I respond now?
Or if you need some time, maybe I'm going to ask another question to Kenichi Sensei.
Oh, okay.
Okay, so the first question for Kenichi Sensei, how do you assess tentatively the knowledge about and interest in developmental state model in Ethiopia today compared to the situation under the previous two regimes? Thank you.
Well, I answered that question a little bit in the previous session. As I said, I think Prime Minister Meles was very serious about learning developmental policies from East Asia, and I think he's very eager and serious, not lip service at all. And also Prime Minister Haile Mariam. But the big difference between Korea and Ethiopia is that bureaucrats, technocrats are not there to concretize and execute and monitor and review the policies. So that's so I have that's a major problem, the lack of competent technocrats. You have to build them. It is not that Ethiopia doesn't have clever people or business-oriented people. You have them, but you do not put them into the right position. In Korea and Japan, in the high growth period, becoming a high official in the Ministry of International Trade and Industry was a great personal privilege, although your salary was low. There's a lot of incentivization for the great people, the good technocrats, to come and work for the government and work overnight and very hard. But in many developing countries, including Ethiopia and Vietnam, people just work for their own benefits. Some people say, I work for Vietnam, but they want the better salaries, the better benefits and better career tracks. Because the government itself does not give you the pride and the privilege for serving the country. So I think that's the biggest problem for Ethiopia. Not only Ethiopia, but most of the developing countries which cannot go beyond the upper middle income. The government is not a place that the very wise people go to for a career track. Another problem I would say in Ethiopia is that although the top leaders are very, very eager, I don't think they are not, what do you call it? They don't have the ground knowledge of how the economy, operates and then the private firms work. If you go to Taiwan, Singapore, and Japanese Meiji, the officials know how the government companies are thinking, how they are moving around, how Toyota and Nissan have different ideas and how to coordinate among them. That this ground knowledge is there. But I don't think the top leaders of many of the countries, including Ethiopia, they lack ground knowledge. So they come up with clever policies, but it doesn't work. It's not accepted by the business community. I would say similar things happen in Malaysia a little bit. Malaysian people are very clever, bureaucrats are very technocratic, but somehow it does not connect very well with the people. So let me stop there.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Kenichi Ohno. So can I ask Professor Horikane, or how do you think?
Okay, so it's
Thank you.
the relationship between political participation and developmental, right? In general, first of all, the political participation is limited. In order for the regime to sustain for the long time rule, then in order for any policy to take effect, the frequent change is not desirable. That's the explanation by them. But actually, in fact, what happened in Taiwan and South Korea and Singapore were all different, very different. That in Taiwan, it was really authoritarian one-party rule. There was no election at all, so that they continued and they just repressed whoever that will say something different. So it was really authoritarian. But in the case of South Korea, at least for the first 10 years, they have the very competitive elections, and they had very vibrant opposition parties. And the regular election was there, very extremely hard. And in order for the Park Chung-hee government to stay in power, they needed to win the election, which really was important. So in a sense, that very much hard or too much opposition was repressed. In the case of, for example, Japan, South Korea, normalization, which was huge, which really ignite the oppositions. But usually the politics was relatively political, competitive. They have political competition, which was not so bad. While in the case of Singapore, they also have multi-party systems, but somehow the ruling party, People's Action Party, is always winning. And the people are to some extent supporting. There are some tricky part, of course, related to the electoral system, but they have kept regular elections and people voted, and the ruling party always won. So it really depends. But anyway, in all the cases, the ruling party really emphasized that we need to continue another term so that the current policy will take effect. That appealed to some extent to the people, while that ended in the 70s in South Korea when the political regime really went to very much authoritarian and manipulating the the electoral system so that they will never win. So that kind of politics were there. And at the end of nearly 2 decades of those South Korea and Taiwan, the people just bursted. They wanted more freedom so that the leaders needed to accept, and they accepted to change, democratize the system into democracy, while it would not happen, have not yet happened in Singapore. So it is tricky, but yes, it is they are saying that stabilization, political stabilization or long-term rule is really important. But there are some kind of people's or popular input there. Therefore, they needed to care about the legitimacy. They needed to persuade the people that they were right. They were doing something at least better for the people. That was the situation. And it really is the matter of the people's reaction, whether to accept that or not. And seemingly, Singaporean people are now starting to change. So in some years, we may have different results from Singapore election. This again is not very much appropriate answer, but let me say so. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Horikane. Then I would like to ask Professor Park to respond to this question. So could you please elaborate on the motives of South Korea or the specific goals it seeks to achieve in giving ODA? Thank you.
So thank you for the wonderful question from the floor. So South Korean government actually is reported set up its first mid-term strategy for international development cooperation from the 2000. That was the request by the OECD DAC as a condition to have a DAC membership. And then every 5 years, it revised the strategy paper. And the current version is the third midterm strategy, which is until 2021 to 2025. And the vision of South Korean foreign aid is written in English, realizing global values and mutual development through cooperation and solidarity. But in Korean, wording is a little bit different. It's for realizing global values and national interest for win-win. So this has been an issue in Korean academic circle, why they translate it differently. In Korean version, it actually written pursue for national interest. But in English version, it's for mutual development. So I think this episode still shows that the developmentalist mindset of the policymakers and their pursuit for like best practice that's learned from Western donors. So we are still in between whether we should go for our own version of development foreign aid, like in when we entered the OECD DAC in 2000, and when we received the first OECD DAC peer review, the government was very much nervous about the recommendations, what kind of recommendation we will get and how much we will be criticized by other DAC members. Then under the Prime Minister's office, they set task force, how to prepare the DAC reviews, like the exam to enter the university, very serious preparation. And that time, I was requested by Koika to learn from the Japan, how Japan prepares the OECD DAC peer review and how they can make some argument by providing foreign loans or tying ODA, because there are not so much praised way of providing foreign aid, right? So at that time, we interviewed Japanese experts and civil society participants, activists, and it was interesting that in Japanese society, academic circle or policy circle, they do not really care the OECD DAC's recommendation anymore, because they kept receiving similar recommendations for more than 50 years, I guess. But in case of South Korea, we are very new member for OECD DAC. So we are, from the very beginning, when we joined the OECD, we were very nervous and we were very much care about how can we excuse our donor behavior. But after 10 years, South Korean government do not care the OECD DAC recommendation. It's like Japan. No task force under Prime Minister's office. So in this way, I think South Korea's developmentalist foreign aid will continue for quite a long period. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Park Sensei. Then I have one question. Maybe this is for Japanese scholar. So maybe for Izumi Sensei, Professor Izumi and Professor Kenichi Ohno, maybe looking back last 2 or 3 decades of Japan, very low growth rates and aggravated ethics of industry operation at factory level. I wonder if Japan is entitled to continue to provide aid to developing countries. What do you think? So maybe Izumi Sensei, you can, do you have something to say?
Much. Okay, so this is kind of because that the Japanese economic growth is stagnated. So we are in a position to the more difficulties. So why do we have to continue the providing development cooperation to other countries? This is my understanding. I think we have to do it. Yeah, because this is a mutually kind of course, that there are various reasons for the humanitarian causes, and also we have to really support that those in the difficulties in any time. At the same time, in this globally connected world, I think as COVID shows, whatever that happened in the world will affect all the country, everybody in the world. So, and also, I mean, this global agenda that the climate change is really pressing for everybody in the world. So I think international cooperation is so important. I think the boundary between national interest, even for those people who are thinking about narrow national interest, we have to really think about globally too. So I think that the international development cooperation continue to play even more important role to play. And also I really feel like that promoting maybe developmental kind of spirit and a concept in today's 21st century SDG oriented in a more inclusive and also sustainable. I think those things have to be really well shared globally, because I think we would like to see more countries kind of that the people will be living in a better living standard and also happily, because otherwise the conflict of the courts will not be kind of the eliminated, and then that may again lead to the another conflict. So I think we have to think about that we are living in a very much connected world. I think there's some kind of question related to what the COVID mean, but I think COVID really made us feel like we are really connected each other, that we have to work together working together. This is what I think. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Izumi. Kenichi Sensei or Professor Horikane, do you have some comments on that?
I would say that the ODA is one of the policy tools that you must use. You know, even if you're becoming poor or stagnating, if you stop, then you have more disasters coming. Like if you're poor, if you're becoming stagnating, do you stop spending on defense or R&D or higher education? Well, these are the things you need. You know, if you just spend everything for social welfare, then the country will go down faster. So I think with the economic stagnation that Japan is in, I think you have to worry about how to spend it, how much to spend it, how you spend it. But just cutting all these, you know, R&D and OD and defense and, you know, education and research is a little bit too extreme. And I would say that the countries which are much poorer than Japan, Thailand, and a long time ago China, no, they were all, you know, helping other countries. That's part of their benefits. If you can't really afford it, if your people are starving or dying, then you can't afford it. But now I think beyond the middle income, I think every country can, you know, use ODA or economic cooperation as the diplomatic tool, although not sufficiently enough. But, okay.
Thank you, Kenichi Sensei. I would like to ask also Professor Park on this question. Well, the situation in South Korea is a little bit different from that ours. But if you have some comments on that view, would you please explain a little bit that?
I think Japan is not that stagnated country. I think Japan is the number one, the most important economic power, and has the leadership that and also development experience that should be shared with other developing countries nowadays through ODA. I think the Japan has very important position in the international development cooperation sector. So I think it should be continued, but it's the same for South Korea, although South Korea also aging society with limited economic growth nowadays, but we need to share our policy experience of the eradicating from poverty. I think that is very important, our responsibility in the global citizens, I guess. So, but this kind of question can be, I think we should, I think it can be a little bit populist questions. So I think we should find out different ways to ask questions, not the and we should see more balanced views on foreign aid, I believe. And then I think in the Q&A, there is Professor Jin-sang Lee from Korea, and he wants to add more views on Ethiopia. Ms. Sayoko, have you read the message from Professor Lee?
Thank you very much, Professor Lee. So thank you very much for joining us. So if you have questions or comments on our panelist presentation, please.
Yeah, unfortunately, I joined very late, so I missed the first two presentations. I was able to capture only the last presenter, Professor Park from Sookmyung Women's University. Actually, I have something to share, but because I think the time is running out, so let me make it very short. Professor Kenichi Ohno talked about Ethiopia. I have been visiting Ethiopia so often, so many times, and then I also met so many leaders there. And during the Meles time, Haile Mariam, it was all right, but now they are in difficulties because of internal political instability, I say. So everything comes from political stability in the first place, so that they can do something. Even many Korean ODA projects were halted, and then they were changing the direction. So still we are having some struggling with the project in Ethiopia. So it is also very important, as Professor Kenichi Ohno said, about leadership and then technocrats. But also it is very important to have a very good governance among the different ministries, have a very same goal to achieve their own development, issues. But if you see the Ethiopian case, you will see that there are so many political appointees who are representing their own ethnic groups. So when you are representing a ethnic group and then another one is representing another ethnic group, they are all trying to get out of the advantages going to their own ethnic groups or regions, which makes it very, very difficult for making a policy coordination. So whenever they try to do something and then other region will object. So there are some difficulties in that case. So political stability should come first, and then also the good governance, if I say, and then also system. And then even we see many very brilliant economists and then high-ranking civil servants in Ethiopia, that their ideas are not really practical or implicable. And there are so many mishandlings in that sense. And coming back to the Korean case, Professor Park shared quite a few things. I also agree with her. But I was a member of International Developmental Cooperation Committee under the Prime Minister for 2 terms. I served with 4 different prime ministers before. Even during that time, we joined the OECD DAC. And then we tried to find the Korean model of ODA, but we couldn't find anything. It is really for Korea. So more or less, we are latecomers, and then we are trying to learn from, say, other earlier joiners like Japan and then USA and some European countries. And in fact, if we see those who are working in HOICA or as a specialist, and then we have a very shortage of experience in international arena. So even say some years ago, when I visited Ethiopia and Tanzania, and then HOICA personnel and some Koreans are very reluctant to join development assistance group meetings or develop any kinds of meetings organized by UN or other international institutions or donors. Why? Because they haven't got much of experience, so they cannot share much with other countries. So still, our ODA project were rather say lower level of implementing say some project which is just building some physical buildings and like that. But nowadays, maybe we are doing quite useful things by focusing on human resource development. If you visit KAIST, Korea Advanced Institute of Science and Technology, you will see many African students are studying, fully financed by the Korean government, and they complete not only undergraduate but graduate studies, including PhD, and then go back their home countries and then try to do something, especially Ethiopia. Quite a few former ministers and then state ministers joined the KAIST, and then they awarded the PhD, and then they went back and then they formed some group, say those who got experience, not only academically but also practically experience with Korea, and they try to adapt how Korea did, and they try to make it much more useful for their own countries. So if you see Korean way of doing ODA, more or less we cannot really distinguish it from others, but we are just following what others were doing. And I hope that this kind of discussion can be continued, and then if there is another chance, then I will try to join too. Thank you very much for such a good, useful forum.
Thank you very much, Professor Lee, for joining us. And the time is almost up, but let me ask one more question to Professor Kenichi Ohno. Many thanks for your open-minded approach to the analysis of those countries with different political economy policies in the post-war period, especially in the multipolar world. Please kindly tell us your views on where these countries characterized by different political economy policies are heading in the future under the increasingly divided multipolar world and within respective countries, which may lead further to instability of our world. Thank you.
In the multiple, let me just say just this thing, it's relationship between the development of democracy and the development of market economy. Both of them require lots of conditions. So you cannot achieve full democracy and full market immediately. You have to build little by little. So it is very natural that low-income country has a very defective democracy. So it is, to me, it is natural that we have to give them ODA and the support when they are low income with limited democracy. So I think it's natural that we want to help the countries with low democracy and low market capacity. So but other countries, some countries say that even if you're low income, you must have a full democracy, a near full democracy. I don't think that is possible. And it was very difficult to have that kind of situation. Now the world is multipolar. Another thing is that most of the developmental states have already gone up. So the remaining countries are the late comers with even less capacity for market and democracy. So I think it's very tough, both on the democracy side and the development side. The 21st century development world will be more difficult and then becoming more complex. As I said, if you have only two leaders, you go to one of them or you just stay away. But when you have so many leaders at the different levels, the game is so complex. And as I said, that you can become a dictator very easily in a world like this. So I agree that the world is getting complex, which means it's more difficult to have more straightforward democracy lessons or market economy lessons. It's not like 1990s when the goal was very clear. So I would say I don't know how to solve this problem, but that's how the world is. Maybe that's the normal state of the history instead of just having one leader or two leaders. Many leaders at different levels and different strengths. I think this is the historical reality we have to cope with. I don't have any clear answer how to cope with this.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Kenichi Ohno. So the time is now up. So I would like to ask Professor Izumi Ohno to conclude the webinar. Thank you.
Okay, so thank you very much for everybody. I think we are already, the time is already passed, so let me short. But I really thought the discussion was so interesting, and also we had a very great surprise, the wonderful surprise that Professor Jin-san Lee is also joining to share his experience in Korea and also that Ethiopian experiences. Because that today's discussion was so important and also complex, so I just cannot kind of provide you one single answer, but I hope certainly that these are issues we have to keep working on in the coming years. So let me just share with you maybe 5 points, which I thought are very important and interesting. The first point is that I think there is a varying degree of maybe authoritarianism. I think Horikane sensei talked about even in the past that maybe Taiwan, South Korea, Singapore, those authoritarian development start at different degree of maybe authoritarianism. So, and also even now, I think that as Kenichi said that low income countries tend to have a maybe political maturity is still kind of under development. So there are some degree of differences. So maybe we should not just take a black and white attitude. And so careful monitoring and also information gathering and also maybe engagement in some cases is very important. And of course, that human rights violation, well, political kind of military shooting that the people, those are not permissible, but maybe electoral process has a very diverse degree. And then if there is a kind of possibility for the legitimacies to be judged based on the popular vote, maybe we have to be maybe take some attitude to more engagement. So I think to what extent how we should engage maybe imperfect democratic countries, that is, we have to keep thinking about it. The second issue is that maybe how to maybe incentivize these emerging or developing countries in global South countries for developmentalism. I think it is still important what happened in like South Korea, for example, or what maybe Rwanda is trying to do, what kind of elements are very important for developmentalism, because leadership have to be economic kind of motivated, and also they have to be a good technocrat have to be put in place, that they're working together with the private sector. And also legitimacy have to be judged by the economic performance and also maybe social inclusion. So I think those are maybe key elements are very important. I think we have to keep discussing what are the really important elements of this developmentalism, how it can happen, how did it happen in certain countries. So maybe I think those developmental kind of elements should not be compromised just for maybe authoritarianism. So I think we have to keep thinking about that, how to kind of keep message of learning together for developmental elements. And then third point is that I think the menu of development cooperation is diverse, and we have to think about how to use it wisely, what kind of mix, because Professor Park talked about that Canada's example is very interesting. I think they are supporting various countries, including maybe non-democratic country, but they put the emphasis on humanitarian aid through civil societies. So that may be one option. So I think we have a various channel of development cooperation, engaging government through policy dialogue or working together for concrete project, at the same time working through civil societies or the non-NGO. So I think we have to, this more complex world, we have to think about wisely what is the best mix for development cooperation menu or channels. And the fourth is, I think, a value-based aid, vice versa developmentalist aid is very, very interesting. I think maybe in rhetoric, I think many countries embrace those things, but how maybe those, I think both two are very important, but how can we make those elements compatible? And I think value-based aid is very important, but not just preaching idealism is not enough. Maybe it should be accompanied by concrete maybe approach in how it can happen. So there is a scope for developmental maybe aid can be placed, included in that kind of maybe space. So I think this value-based aid, vice versa, or together with developmental aid, we have to, I think we should keep working on. And lastly, I thought it is very important to work with development partners, both Korea is no longer emerging donor, is really that important key the DAC donors. Recently, other donors are also coming into, but I think it's important to work with development partners who have real experiences of development, who have coped with challenges, how to make it compatible with this political development and also economic development with social inclusion. I think those are dilemmas, but I think those dilemmas and how to cope with that concretely would be very important. So knowledge cooperation among those South-South cooperation, triangular cooperation, or engaging with emerging donors, I think those things are very important to share concrete example, not just kind of talking about, I think idealism is important, but I think reality on the ground have to be looked into. So I think those things are things which I thought very interesting, and that I hope I can also keep working with many of you which have an interest in this topic. So thank you very much for today's participation, and let me give a big hand to today's speakers.